Hello, welcome to Boyd's Blue Alpine Freeze Dryer channel. Today I'm going to be freeze drying chicken broth, which we got from boiling down 20 pounds of chicken. Freeze dried the chicken in my last batch, and now I'm going to try to boil down the broth, or freeze dry the broth that we boiled down out of the chicken. So we boiled all the bones and leftover meat, and now we have a bunch of broth which I have frozen in some silicone molds. And the fat has floated to the top, and I know with freeze drying fat it tends to not last very long, so we'll probably have to use this for the next 6 months to a year, maybe 2 years. I wouldn't try to store this for 25 years just because there's so much fat in the broth itself. But I will try to freeze dry the water out and see what I end up with, see if it's something that I can use to reconstitute with water and get a chicken broth. And for now we'll just start by weighing, and I wash my hands, opening the silicone molds, putting the broth on the tray so I can weigh them and find out exactly how much silicone or how much broth I'm actually getting out of each silicone mold, and we will then go from there and put it in the freeze dryer. You might hear the freeze dryer running in the background. I've turned on the refrigeration unit to kind of cool it down a bit. Because this has been pre-frozen, I'm not going to run the freeze cycle of the freeze dryer, but I do need to make sure that there's no wet liquid from the broth defrosting while I'm putting it on these trays and measuring it. And so I'll set it in for about a half hour of freeze time before, but I want to put it in a cold unit before I try to freeze dry it. So that's where we're at now. Let me start opening up these molds and see what I get. So here's the first block. It's about a ½ inch thick. It's got a little bit of fat on top, not too bad. So I'll set that one there. The second mold I had just had a whole bunch of little cubes, and hoping that if these do actually stay as a cube, I will maybe be able to just use each block kind of like a bouillon cube. So I've got big blocks I'll just put in reconstitute soup, little blocks that are hopefully going to be used like a bouillon cube or something. So let's see what I get here. The last ones had a little bit more fat because they were the ones that were at the bottom of the tray. So stick this in the refrigeration unit so I can start freeze drying. I didn't measure the weight here, so let's see. Got the weight of the tray. Put another tray on here. Zero that one out. Normal, 16 ounces. And so this one weighs 1,434 grams. Let me write that down in my notebook. So I've got that when I'm finished. Sorry about this. So 30 grams. Okay. So I've been trailing. I find these silicone molds work really well for freezing things like eggs, or in this case the broth or whatever, just because it is so easy to get the frozen food out of the mold. I tried, when I first froze eggs, the first time I tried to do it, I tried lining a cookie sheet with aluminum foil, and the aluminum foil just stuck to the eggs. It really was useless. But these silicone molds really do work well. They're just so easy to remove the food after it's frozen, and they're really easy to wash too. So I just really love these silicone molds. I got them on the internet. They weren't very expensive, but you know, you can buy them on Amazon or whatever your preferred online site is. So you get the weight on this one. So there's 1,700 1,700 grams on the second tray. Put that in there. Last tray. Somehow that tray is still wet. I don't know where that water came from. I know where the water came from. Came from the previous chicken broth separator that I had on there. I had some chicken broth on it, so I throw them onto it, so I stuck on there. So I'm going to reset this one to 0 again. So it's just there we go. And we'll load this with my last piece of chicken broth. These ones clearly have a lot of fat on them again, so I'm not sure why some of these have a lot of fat on the top layer, some of them don't have fat. I probably could scrape all these pieces of fat off of this and maybe make the broth or the freeze-dried food last a little longer without all the fat. I've watched different videos on people freeze-drying things with fat in it, and people saying you can't freeze-dry anything with fat in it, and when you look at the commercially freeze-dried items and the percentage of fat that they have and some of the things like their hamburger stuff, I'm convinced that it is okay to freeze-dry some fat. I think this might be a bit much fat just because it's all in one layer at the top. As a matter of fact, I might, just for fun, I might just scrape off a piece from the scraper up there and sanitize that really quick. I think I'm going to scrape off just a touch of, I'm going to scrape the fat off of one of these just to see how it works out, see how different it works out from the rest of them that have got lots of fat on them. So, let's take one that has clearly got a lot of fat on it, like this one here. You should scrape the fat off with this this food scraper, or this, scraper up and broken in half. That's okay. Shaving off as much of the fat layer as I can. There you go. That one's all gone. Now I've just got that little cube there. And I'll scrape off a bit more from this one. Unfortunately, putting this broth in my hand, it's starting to melt. And so instead of being a solid block of ice, because I had it in my fingers, my palm is now kind of wet and dripping, and that's going to put moisture in the freeze dryer, which needs to be frozen out before I try to turn the freeze dryer on. I now have all of the chicken broth in the freeze dryer. I've weighed it all, and I'm now going to go ahead and show you the settings and how to set this up. Since I have pre-frozen the items, but I also want to make sure that there's no moisture in there. As I was scraping some of the fat off the last block, just to kind of see how it worked different with no fat on top, I did melt some of it under my hand because it was in my hands as I was scraping it, so some of the moisture got in there. So I want to make sure there's no moisture in there. That'll cause the vacuum pump to give an error. So I will run the freezing part of this for maybe 15 minutes just to make sure. It's been running for about 10 or 15 minutes while I've been putting it in, so it's been having a chance to freeze. And by running 15 minutes, it should have all of any moisture that got onto the broth while I was putting it on the trays should be able to freeze up before then. Try this again. Recipes. Liquid. I didn't realize there was a liquid recipe here, so continue. Freeze dry. Stop at 15 this time instead of going to 0. Alright, so 15 minutes of freeze time, and then from there it was showing 20 hours. I think I'm going to add more time to that, so let me just run this and change that up to 24 hours. Okay, so this is the same as the meat cycle, 130 degree temperature. The difference was the meat had 21 hours, this only started at 20. I just want to be absolutely sure because there's so much moisture in there. I want to make absolutely sure that it will actually dehydrate, so I'm giving it 24 hours instead of the recommended 30 or 20 hours. The vacuum pump, you heard it just kick on. If there was any moisture still in there, if there's actually any liquid that had not been frozen yet, it would have created a fault. So the fact that there's no fault tells me I did have it in the freezer long enough to have everything frozen. So, well, let's come back and check it tomorrow and we'll see what I've got. Thank you. All right, I am now back with my chicken broth. I'm going to call this batch a learning experience. I won't say it's a complete failure. I won't say it was a success. Some of the pieces turned out beautifully. This piece of broth is nice and flaky, dry. There was one little tiny section, there's one corner over here has a bit of fat that was obviously, not something I'd want to store for years, but for temporary, use in the next 6 months or a year, it probably worked great. However, other pieces, let me show this close to you here. You can see some of these that had a lot of fat. If you remember, I showed some that had some fat on top. The fat just congealed in the center and basically melted all the way through. And you just see the fat in there. It just did not work. All the fat that was on there did not, dehydrate. It just turned to fat and it dripped through the chicken broth and became a glob of just chicken fat on the tray. It just wiped right up like chicken fat. It's pretty gross and not something that I would store for more than a week outside a fridge. Probably wouldn't even store it outside the fridge for more than a day. However, this big block here had very little fat in it. Turned out amazing. It's just all flaky. Doesn't seem like there's any fat. There's looks like one little possible corner of fat right there on that corner. You can kind of see where there's a little bit of hole there. But the fat didn't drop through the bottom. It didn't stay there. I might cut this part off and save this part and just use that. Maybe freeze dry that piece and package that up in a Mylar bag. If I cut that corner off so it's just the dry flaky part. That part turned out great. Like I said, this part turned out great. What I think I'm finding is the ones that had a lot of fat on the top of the broth when it went in. If you remember, I broke this one off at the beginning. I scraped the fat off. That one where I scraped the fat off turned out perfect. There's like nice flaky, just nice broth. The rest of these had a large amount of fat on them. This one here, large amount of fat on top. It just soaked through, dripped through the bottom. It's kind of disgusting. This one had a lot of fat on it. It looks like the fat kind of disappeared. It feels pretty good. This one, right through the bottom. So it's kind of hit and miss with the ones that had fat on it. That one, the fat kind of soaked through the bottom. That one, I can feel the fat on the side. It just still feels kind of wet. Just mostly fat. This one feels heavy with lots of fat. That one feels heavy with lots of fat in it. And I know this batch here started off and I can still feel some fat in there. It's not showing any more water coming out, so it's just fat that's not dehydrating. So I did have another 3/4 of a gallon that before I froze it, I'd put it in the refrigerator and the fat had separated in that pitcher. So before I put it in the freezer, I scraped off about 1/4 of an inch of fat from the top. I suspect that that batch will go through perfectly and turn out really nice and flaky, kind of like this one here, where I'd scraped off all the fat, where it turns out really nice. We did take a bite of some earlier. It tastes like a very strong chicken broth. It's really quite tasty. I think it's going to make a good broth when it's reconstituted. But because of the amount of fat in this, I'm not going to try to package it up for long-term storage. I'm just going to use this, put it in the refrigerator and probably use it within the next few weeks and just reconstitute some chicken broth, maybe make some chicken soup in the next week or two, because I'm not about to try to use this long-term storage. But I learned something. Either let your water, I originally froze these blocks in the silicone molds while it was still warm from the chicken after simmering it down. I think next time I will sit it overnight in a jar or a pitcher that I can separate the fat from it. And I'll let the fat harden and then take off all the fat from the top and just put in the bouillon. That also, when I did that, kind of turned into a gelatin, almost like a gel broth. So what I'm freezing on my next batch will just be a broth that was almost a thick gelatin, and then I froze that into the mold, and I'm going to pour that and make another batch. For my batch 4 will be more chicken broth but without the fat. So I'm going to say this was a learning experience, not a failure, but it's definitely not what I was expecting to get. I was hoping that I would get a lot more of these really light chicken broth cubes or blocks, and this worked out really nicely where there was all the fat scraped off beforehand. So yeah, I've seen that you can freeze dry things with fat in it, but you don't want to layer of fat on the top of each item. It obviously has just soaked through. Like I said, these ones here are just still full of fat. This one feels 5 times as heavy as this one. Well, that was empty, but it feels a lot heavier than this lightweight that had no fat in it. So this fat obviously did not dehydrate out. The fat just kind of dropped to the middle and became a mess of just fat on the tray itself. You just see the fat and the grease on the tray. So I'm not going to go ahead and show you packaging this up. I'm just going to call this one done. I will package a few of these, and maybe, you know, the ones that don't have any leftover fat in it, the rest of them I'm just going to put in a bag and use it for now. Just Ziploc bag it and use it the next few days. But thank you very much for following me, and if you learned something from this, if I can save you from making the same mistakes with your batch, that's why I'm here. So thank you again. If you're finding this channel useful, please share it with friends, and subscribe if you're enjoying this. And thank you for joining me, and you have a good day.